Have you ever known something in your bones? A certainty so deep it sings in your blood, a truth that hums beneath your skin, even when the whole world, with all its maps and machines and metals, tells you that you are wrong. Have you ever held a warning on your tongue that felt heavier than stone, knowing that to speak it was to be dismissed, but to stay silent was to invite disaster? This is a story about a voice like that. A quiet voice in a world of noise, a voice that belonged to a woman no one saw, right before she saved them all. The dust of the Convoy Valley tasted of rust and regret. It coated the tongues of the soldiers and clung to the hulking, sand-colored flanks of their armored vehicles. A convoy of 12, a steel serpent inching its way through the arteries of a forgotten war, carrying medicine that was worth more than gold and men who were worth more than the machines they drove. In the lead vehicle, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and simmering tension. Captain Marcus Eva stared at the digital map on his console, his eyes tracing the red line that marked their route through a notorious pass up ahead known to the locals as the Serpent's Tooth. He was a good man, a man who measured his worth in the lives he brought home, but the weight of command had etched permanent lines of fatigue around his eyes. Beside him, Lieutenant Thorne radiated an unnerving energy, a mix of ambition and arrogance polished to a high sheen at a military academy thousands of miles away. He saw the world as a series of objectives to be captured, of protocols to be followed. To him, the valley was just a grid on a map, and its people were little more than inconvenient variables. And in the cramped seat behind them sat the most inconvenient variable of all. Her name was Alara. She had been hired in the last village, a local guide to navigate the shifting loyalties and ancient grudges of the valley. She was a ghost in the corner of their eyes, a slight figure wrapped in a coarse gray shawl, her face obscured so that only her eyes were visible, dark, deep-set, and holding a stillness that seemed at odds with the rumbling engine and the ever-present threat of violence. She had not spoken a word for 2 hours. She simply watched the landscape flow past, her gaze lingering on the flock of a bird, the direction of the wind in the tall, desiccated grass, the shape of a shadow in a rocky outcrop. She was reading a map no one else could see, a map written in the language of the land itself. The convoy ground to a halt at a fork in the road. To the left, a wide, well-trodden path cut straight towards the looming silhouette of the Serpent's Tooth. It was the route on Eva's map, the logical choice, the path of least resistance. To the right, a barely there track, little more than a whisper of a trail, snaked up into the unforgiving ridges. It looked difficult, dangerous, and slow. Thorne pointed confidently to the left. "This is it, sir. The pass is 5 clicks ahead. We'll be through before dusk." The comms unit crackled, a voice from the next vehicle asking for confirmation. Eva was about to give the order when a soft voice filled the small cabin, a voice as dry as the dust outside. "We do not go that way." Thorne turned, an expression of sheer disbelief on his face. He had almost forgotten Alara was there. He looked at her as one might look at a piece of equipment that had suddenly malfunctioned. "What did you say?" Alara did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the wide path to the left, on the mouth of the pass that seemed to be watching them. "The road is hungry," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "It is waiting to be fed." Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Hungry? Captain, are we really going to listen to this? We have a schedule. We have orders." Eva held up a hand, silencing him. He had been in this part of the world long enough to know that logic was a fragile shield against an enemy who thought in generations, not hours. He leaned back, his eyes finding Alara's in the rearview mirror. "What do you see, Alara?" he asked, his tone respectful. Thorne shifted in his seat, his jaw tight with indignation. Alara finally turned her head, her dark eyes meeting Eva's. "I see what is not there," she said, her words cryptic but carrying an undeniable weight. "There are no goat tracks on that road. The shepherds have not used it today." "Why?" "The birds are not singing from the rocks that guard the entrance." "Why?" "The air, it carries no life. Only stillness." "A hunter's stillness," the lieutenant scoffed, unable to contain his contempt. "Bird songs and goat tracks. Sir, this is military strategy, not poetry." The enemy uses IEDs and RPGs, not bad omens. We have electronic countermeasures, aerial surveillance, and a platoon of trained soldiers. We are not afraid of a quiet road, he gestured dismissively at Alara. We paid her to guide us through villages, not to second-guess established military routes. His words were sharp, designed to remind Eva of the proper order of things, of the chain of command that did not include local fortune-tellers. But Alara's warning had planted a seed of doubt in Eva's mind. He had seen too many good men die because they had trusted their technology more than their instincts. He had seen ambushes spring from roads that had been declared safe by intelligence reports written by analysts who had never set foot in the country. He remembered a grizzled sergeant telling him years ago, "The land always tells you the truth, sir. You just have to know how to listen." He looked from the pristine red line on his digital map to the ancient, knowing eyes of the woman in the back seat. One was a product of data and algorithms, a sterile promise of efficiency. The other was a product of survival, of generations of lived and died experience on this very soil. The dust on that road, Alara continued, her voice pulling Eva's attention back. It has been disturbed, but not by the wind. It was swept to hide the digging. They want you to think it is untouched. They want you to see an easy path. Her certainty was absolute. It wasn't a guess, it was a statement of fact. Thorne threw his hands up in exasperation. This is insane. She's making it up. Swept dust. Sir, we are the authority here. We have the intelligence. We have the firepower. We cannot allow our mission to be dictated by the paranoid fantasies of a local. The conflict hung in the air, as thick and heavy as the dust outside. It was more than a disagreement over a route, it was a clash of worlds. Thorne's world of rigid order, of quantifiable risk and by-the-book procedure, versus Alara's world of intuition, of subtle signs and ancestral knowledge. Eva was caught in the middle, the fulcrum on which dozens of lives now rested. He looked at Thorne, at the crisp uniform and the unwavering self-assurance, and he saw a dangerous blindness, the kind of arrogance that gets people killed. Then he looked at Alara, at her worn shawl and her steady, unblinking gaze, and he saw a deep, painful wisdom. He knew what the regulations said. He knew what Thorne was thinking, that he was being weak, letting emotion or superstition cloud his judgment. A formal inquiry would crucify him if he diverted from the planned route for such a flimsy reason and something went wrong. He could lose his command. He could lose everything. But then he imagined the alternative. He imagined the deafening roar of an explosion, the shriek of twisted metal, the smell of burning fuel and flesh. He imagined writing letters home to mothers and fathers, trying to explain how their sons had died on a road that a quiet woman with sad eyes had warned him not to take. The imagined weight of those letters was far heavier than the weight of any reprimand. He made his choice. He keyed his radio. All call signs, this is Alpha 1. We are diverting. I repeat, we are diverting. We will not be taking the main pass. We are taking the tertiary route up the East Ridge. Follow our lead, the radio crackled with confused acknowledgments. Through the thick glass of the windscreen, Eva could see the other drivers and commanders looking towards his vehicle, their expressions a mixture of surprise and concern. Inside the cab, Thorne was rigid with fury. Captain, I must formally object to this decision. You are jeopardizing this entire convoy based on nothing. That ridge trail isn't rated for our vehicles. We could lose a truck over the side. It will add hours to our journey. It is an unjustifiable, reckless deviation from the mission plan. Eva met his subordinate's glare with a look of cold steel. Your objection is noted, Lieutenant. It will be included in my report, right next to the section where I explain why we are all still alive. He turned his attention away from Thorne, his decision made absolute. He looked to Alara. Get us through, he said. It was not a question. It was a plea. Alara gave a single, slow nod. She opened her door and slipped out into the oppressive heat. She began to walk, not looking back, her small frame a stark contrast to the hulking machines that now crawled behind her. She was their guide. She was their hope. The convoy lurched forward, turning away from the wide, inviting path of the Serpent's Tooth, and onto the treacherous goat track. The journey was punishing. The engines of the heavy vehicles groaned in protest as they climbed the steep incline, their tires struggling for purchase on the loose scree. Inside the cabs, soldiers gripped their seats, their knuckles white, as the trucks tilted at precarious angles, the valley floor falling away alarmingly beside them. Thorn sat in stony silence, his anger a palpable force in the small space. Every lurch of the vehicle, every spray of gravel against the undercarriage, was another piece of evidence for the court-martial he was already conducting in his mind. He was documenting Eva's failure, moment by agonizing moment. Eva ignored him. His focus was entirely on the small figure of Alara, kicking her way up the path with an unhurried, certain grace. She moved like she was a part of the mountain, her feet finding purchase where it seemed there was none. She would pause, hold up a hand, and the entire multi-ton convoy would halt. She would point to a patch of unstable rock or a section of the path that was too narrow, directing the lead driver with subtle gestures. She was a conductor orchestrating a clumsy, mechanical orchestra, and slowly, painstakingly, they were making their way up the ridge. An hour passed. Then another. The sun beat down, and the mood in the convoy was sour. The soldiers were tired, frustrated, and questioning the captain's judgment. They couldn't see what he saw. They couldn't see the quiet confidence of their guide, only the immediate danger and difficulty of the path she had chosen. Finally, they reached a small plateau near the summit of the ridge. It offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the valley below. And there, laid out before them like a map, was the Serpent's Tooth Pass, the road they were supposed to have taken. Eva brought the vehicle to a stop and raised his binoculars to his eyes, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. Had he made a colossal mistake? Had he endangered his men for nothing more than a woman's strange feeling? He scanned the pass. At first, he saw nothing but rocks and shadows, the empty road baking in the afternoon sun. Thorn let out a cynical little huff, a sound that said, "I told you so." He was already reaching for the radio, perhaps to order the convoy to turn back. But then Eva's breath caught in his throat. He adjusted the focus, his heart beginning to pound against his ribs. It was a glint. A tiny flicker of reflected light, almost invisible against the dun-colored rock. The kind of glint that comes from the coated lens of a rifle scope. He swept the binoculars to the left, his movements now frantic. He found another. And another. Then he saw the movement. A figure, clad in dusty fatigues, shifting position behind a boulder. His blood ran cold. He lowered the binoculars slowly, panning across the entire length of the pass. The rocks were alive with them. Dozens of them. Insurgents, armed and waiting, concealed in perfectly prepared positions that commanded every inch of the road. But that wasn't the worst of it. Eva focused on the narrowest section of the pass. He could see them now that he knew where to look, the telltale signs of disturbed earth, the almost invisible wires running down the cliff face. Shaped charges. Enough to collapse the entrance and the exit of the pass simultaneously, turning the entire road into a mile-long coffin. It was a perfectly designed kill box. They would have driven straight into the heart of it, and the first explosion would have sealed their fate. The lead and rear vehicles would be disabled, trapping everyone in between. Then, the massacre would have begun from the high ground. No one would have stood a chance. It would have been over in minutes. The sheer, terrifying audacity of the trap stole the air from his lungs. This wasn't a random IED. This was a deliberate, meticulously planned annihilation. He felt a wave of nausea. He lowered the binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. His face was ashen. Without a word, he pushed the high-powered optics into Thorn's chest. "Look," he rasped, his voice hoarse. Thorn took them, an arrogant smirk still playing on his lips. He raised them to his eyes, expecting to see nothing, ready to unleash his fury on Eva. The smirk vanished. The color drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly, chalky white. His mouth fell slightly open. He scanned the pass, just as Eva had done, and the reality of what he was seeing descended on him like a physical blow. He saw the hidden riflemen. He saw the command wires for the explosives. He saw the waiting RPG teams. But most of all, he saw himself, dead in the driver's seat of his burning vehicle. He saw the faces of all the men in the convoy, their lives extinguished because of his stubborn, blind pride. He would have led them all to their deaths, cheerfully, arrogantly, quoting regulations all the way. He lowered the binoculars, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. He looked at the empty road below, then at the treacherous path they had just climbed. He looked at Captain Eva, whose face was a mask of grim vindication. And finally, he looked at Alara, who was standing a few feet away, staring not at the pass, but at a small, resilient flower growing between two rocks, as if the scene of their near demise was of no consequence to her. She had known. She hadn't needed high-powered optics or satellite intelligence. She had read the silence of the birds and the fear of the dust, and she had saved every single one of them. The silence in the command vehicle was absolute. It was a heavy, profound silence, filled with the ghosts of what might have been. The grumbling of the soldiers in the convoy had died down as word of what the captain and lieutenant had seen began to filter down the line. Men who had been cursing the rocky path moments before were now looking at it with a newfound gratitude. They were alive because they were on it. Thorn finally broke the silence, his voice a choked whisper. "My God, sir, we would have," he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Eva keyed his comms, his own voice steady now, sharpened by the adrenaline, and the terrible clarity of their situation. "All call signs, this is Alpha 1. Be advised, the primary route through grid 7 to 4 is a confirmed enemy ambush. Massive force dug in, with extensive explosives. I say again, the entire pass is a kill box." A wave of stunned acknowledgements came back over the radio. Eva continued, his mind racing, processing the new reality. Their mission was no longer simply about delivering supplies. It was about survival. But now they had an advantage. The enemy didn't know they had been seen. The hunters were still waiting, patient and oblivious, for prey that was never going to arrive. A new plan began to form in Eva's mind, a bold and dangerous idea. He looked at Alara. She had turned from the flower and was now watching him, her expression unreadable. In that moment, he understood that the maps and protocols he had built his career on were meaningless here. She was the map now. Her knowledge, her intuition, was their single greatest tactical asset. He got out of the vehicle and walked over to her, Thorn following like a chastened shadow. "Alara," Eva said, his voice imbued with a respect that bordered on reverence. "They are waiting for us in the pass. They think we are coming from the west." He pointed across the valley, towards the far side of the mountain range that formed the Serpent's Tooth. "Is there a way through these mountains? A way to get to the other side of that pass, behind them, without being seen?" Thorn stood by, his head bowed, listening. The arrogant officer was gone, replaced by a humbled soldier who was finally beginning to understand the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Alara considered the question, her gaze sweeping across the jagged peaks. She was silent for a long time, reading the terrain, tracing invisible lines through the rock. Finally, she pointed with her chin towards a dark cleft in the mountainside. "There is a way," she said. "It is not a path for soldiers. It is a path for ghosts. The smugglers use it. It follows the dry riverbed through the canyons. The rock walls will hide you from the sky. It will be slow, and the stones are sharp. But it is a silent path." Eva looked at the treacherous route she indicated, then back at the unsuspecting ambush site. The plan solidified in his mind. It was a huge risk, but the potential reward was enormous. They could turn the tables completely. They could neutralize a major threat and secure this entire valley for weeks to come. "We're taking it," he said, his decision final. He looked at Thorn. "Lieutenant, get on the radio. I want radio silence from this point on. We move on hand signals only. Tell the men we're going hunting." Thorn simply nodded, his eyes filled with a newfound, desperate eagerness to follow orders. He finally understood that his life, and the lives of everyone in the convoy, depended not on the rulebook, but on the quiet woman in the grey shawl. The journey that followed was a descent into a different world. The convoy left the sun-scorched ridge and entered the cool shadows of the canyon Alara had indicated. It was less a road than a scar in the earth, a winding chasm of rock and sand. The high canyon walls pressed in on them, blocking out the sky and muffling the sound of their engines. It was claustrophobic and tense. Alara once again walked ahead, a silent scout in a labyrinth of stone. She seemed to draw strength from the harsh landscape, moving with an eerie, weightless grace. The soldiers, now fully aware of how close they had come to death, watched her with a kind of superstitious awe. They followed her directions without question. When she held up a hand, a dozen engines were cut instantly. When she pointed to a patch of soft sand, drivers skillfully navigated around it. She was their lifeline, their oracle. During a brief halt to let the engines cool, Eva approached her as she stood examining the canyon wall. "How did you know, Alara?" he asked quietly. Not just that the road was dangerous, but how dangerous it was. She ran a hand over the rough stone, her fingers tracing lines that were invisible to him. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "This valley has many ghosts," she said, her voice soft and heavy with memory. "Years ago, the road you wanted to take, it was my family's road. We were traveling to the market. My husband, my two small sons." She paused, and in the silence, Eva could hear the echo of an old, bottomless grief. They were not soldiers. They were not an enemy. But they were in the way. There was an ambush. Not for us, but for a patrol that was supposed to pass later. We were just early. She finally turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw the raw pain that her stillness usually concealed. "I was thrown from the cart. I was the only one who survived. I hid in the rocks and watched. I learned the signs. I learned the stillness that comes before the noise. I learned the mountain's voice that day, Captain, because the voices of my family went silent here. That road does not forget. And neither do I." The story struck Eva with the force of a physical blow. Her knowledge wasn't supernatural, it was born from the deepest trauma imaginable. She wasn't just a guide, she was a survivor, and her senses had been honed to a razor's edge by loss. Thorne, who had been standing nearby, heard every word. A deep, burning shame washed over him. He had mocked this woman's pain. He had called her wisdom superstition. He saw her now not as an obstacle or a variable, but as a person of incredible strength and resilience. He felt an overwhelming need to atone. He stepped forward, his movements stiff. "Alara," he began, his voice cracking slightly. He stopped, unsure of what to say. He ended up just giving a short, sharp nod of respect, a gesture that conveyed more than any apology could. For the first time, a flicker of something other than sorrow crossed Alara's face. It was a quiet acknowledgement. The journey continued, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just a military unit with a local guide. They were a team, united by a shared purpose and a profound respect for the woman leading them. Late in the afternoon, after hours of painstaking navigation, Alara stopped. She pointed upwards. They had reached the end of the canyon. A narrow, steep path led up to the ridge. From here, they could see the rear of the Serpent's Tooth Pass. They had made it. They were behind the enemy. The hunters had become the hunted. Eva and his men moved with a silent, deadly grace they hadn't possessed that morning. They were no longer just following orders, they were fighting for a woman who had saved them, for the memory of her family, and for their own second chance at life. They crested the ridge, weapons ready. Below them, the ambush was still in place. The insurgents were relaxed, confident, some of them sharing food, completely unaware of the fate that was descending upon them from behind. Eva gave the signal. The confrontation was brutally efficient. It was not a battle, it was a swift and decisive removal of a threat. The element of complete surprise was overwhelming. The soldiers moved with precision, their actions fueled by adrenaline and a chilling sense of purpose. They were not just neutralizing an enemy force, they were avenging the ghosts of this valley. When it was over, a profound quiet settled over the pass once more. But this time, it was a true quiet, a quiet of safety, not of menace. The mission was a success, but not the mission they had set out to accomplish. They had not just delivered medical supplies, they had reclaimed a piece of this valley from the shadows. The convoy finally rolled into the destination village just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The delivery of the supplies was met with quiet gratitude. But the real victory was not in the cargo they had brought, but in the wisdom they had gained. Before they departed, Captain Eva assembled his entire platoon. He called Alara to stand before them. He removed his own commendation bar from his uniform, and in a gesture that broke a dozen regulations, pinned it to her simple gray shawl. "We are all alive because of this woman," he announced, his voice ringing with conviction. "She saw what our technology could not. She knew what our intelligence did not. Her courage and her wisdom are worth more than any weapon in our arsenal." He then made her a formal offer, a permanent, well-paid position as a special consultant for his entire command. "We need you, Alara," he said simply. "We need to learn how to listen again." Then, Lieutenant Thorne stepped forward. He stood before Alara, his posture rigid, but his eyes were filled with a humility that had been unthinkable that morning. He offered a crisp, formal salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was arrogant and I was a fool. My pride almost cost these men their lives. You saved us. I am in your debt." "Thank you." Alara looked at the humbled officer, at the captain, and at the faces of the soldiers watching her with undisguised reverence. She had spent a lifetime being invisible, her voice unheard. Now she was seen. She simply inclined her head, a gesture of grace and forgiveness. Her victory was not in their praise, but in the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, of lives saved, of a small piece of the world made safer. As the convoy prepared to leave, she stood watching the sun dip below the mountains, her small frame silhouetted against the vast landscape. She was no longer a ghost. She was a guardian. So I ask you again, how many voices do we ignore every day? How much wisdom do we dismiss because it doesn't come packaged in a uniform, or a fancy degree, or a confident tone? The world's most important truths, the most vital warnings, are often whispered, not shouted. They come from the people we overlook, the ones who have learned to read the silence. Remember Alara. And the next time you hear a quiet voice speaking a difficult truth, have the courage to stop, and have the wisdom to listen. Share this story if you believe that every voice deserves to be heard, and remind someone today that what they know matters.